Hey guys, tonight we're heading somewhere damp, drafty and way too obsessed with sin. Yep, you guessed it, the Middle Ages. But not just the sword-clashing, king-crowning, plague-infested part. No, tonight we're getting into what no one in your high school history textbook dared to cover. What sex was actually like back then. Spoiler alert, you probably won't survive this. Emotionally, at least. Because if you think it's hard to date in the modern world, just wait until you're legally obligated to marry your cousin, told that pleasure is a sin, and your mattress is stuffed with straw and possibly alive. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Go ahead, I'll wait. Also, drop your city and the time down in the comments. Just curious who else is up way too late for this kind of weird history. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing in a one-room hut, probably somewhere in the English countryside around the year 1247. It's evening. Outside, the pigs are snoring, and inside, well, you'd better hope they didn't sneak in. Your bed is basically a few planks with a bag of straw on top. The straw's itchy, probably crawling with a few extras, and the blanket is a coarse wool that smells suspiciously like wet dog. There's one candle burning, wax dripping slowly down the side, and it's the only thing lighting the room. You'd like some privacy? That's adorable, because in this house, there are 4 other people sleeping on the floor. Your in-laws, your children, and possibly a neighbour or two, all sharing space like a sweaty medieval sleepover. And yet, somehow, this is where sex is expected to happen. Quietly, efficiently, and without complaint. For all the romanticised imagery we've built around the Middle Ages, think dramatic courtships, flowing gowns, maybe a lute or two, the real story begins in places like this. Poor, rural, and utterly unsexy. Your daily life is exhausting. You've been farming since sunrise, your hands are rough, your body aches, and you're going to sleep with dirt still under your nails. You don't date, you don't flirt. You get married because your parents arranged it when you were 14 and the other person came with a dowry and 2 goats. Romantic, right? But here's the kicker. Despite the constant religious pressure, physical discomfort and overwhelming poverty, people still had sex. A lot of it. Partly because there was nothing else to do, partly because the church said marriage meant you had to, and partly because medieval people were, well, people. Let's be clear, the church dominated everything. Sex was supposed to be for procreation, not pleasure. The ideal was solemn, silent, and strictly missionary. Everything else? Sin. And not just your garden variety sin. There were entire manuals written about which acts were worse than others, and exactly how long you'd need to atone for them. We'll get into those spicy details later, don't worry. But out here, away from the monasteries and stone cathedrals, people lived in a world of compromise. They had desires, needs, and they figured out how to carve out slivers of intimacy between the rules. Maybe it was a whispered promise under the stars. Maybe it was a stolen moment behind the barn. Or maybe it was just knowing when your in-laws were drunk enough to stay asleep. Still, there's no denying, your options were limited. Bathing wasn't common, especially in rural areas, and deodorant hadn't even been invented as a concept. Imagine crawling into bed next to someone who smells like a fermented onion stew and wet sheep. Now imagine you both smell like that. That's what passion looks like tonight. And then there's the mattress. You shift on the straw and feel something small scuttle under your back. It's probably a beetle or a mouse. Either way, you do what everyone else does. Ignore it and hope it doesn't join in. Curiously, historians actually argue about how much privacy medieval people had or needed. Some scholars say that communal sleeping arrangements were so normalised that people didn't even think twice about sex happening just a few feet away. Others argue that couples must have found ways to separate themselves, even if it meant heading out to the barn. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. Depending on where you lived and how much space you had, discretion could be anywhere from impossible to moderately achievable. But here's a quirky fact to keep in your back pocket. Some medieval homes had what was called an alcove bed, a sort of wooden box bed with sliding doors or curtains. Think of it like the original sex pod. If you were lucky, or at least a wealthier peasant, you could slide the little wooden panel shut and enjoy something resembling privacy, though sound still travelled. especially when the walls were made of twigs and mud. And don't even think about getting kinky. Literally everything besides reproduction in the missionary position was considered either dangerous, diabolical, or both. Oral sex, forbidden, rear entry, that might land you on the wrong side of divine judgment. Even having sex on certain days like Fridays, feast days, or pretty much any day with religious significance, so most days, was frowned upon. Lust itself was viewed as a moral failing, a spiritual disease. But despite the intense repression, medieval folks were far from sexless. Some letters, ballads, and diaries that survive from the era hint at affection, longing, and even, gasp, romantic desire. And not just in the noble courts. Peasant girls carved hearts into trees, farm boys composed dirty songs, humans gonna human. Of course, not all of it was sweet. Consent wasn't well defined, marriage could be coerced, and power. Dynamics played a huge role in who got to enjoy sex and who didn't. The lines were blurry, and justice was selective. If you're waiting for that part of the story, don't worry. We'll get into it later too. Fair warning, it's not exactly bedtime material. For now, though, you curl up under your scratchy blanket, listen to the pigs snorting softly outside, and try not to think about the lice in your hair. Tomorrow's another 16-hour work day, and if you're lucky, you might get 10 minutes alone with your spouse behind the barn. Just don't let the priest find out. Or worse, your mother-in-law. You wake up to the sound of a rooster screeching somewhere far too close to your face. Light is streaming in through a hole in the wall that technically counts as a window. Your back hurts from sleeping on lumpy straw, your mouth tastes like old barley, and you can already hear someone loudly emptying a chamber pot outside. Morning in the Middle Ages, baby. But before the grind of farm work or bread baking or whatever medieval life throws at you next, let's talk about who's really running your sex life. The Church. More specifically, the towering, all-seeing Catholic Church, whose members were, at least in theory, supposed to be celibate and spiritually pure. In practice, they were some of the nosiest, most judgmental bedroom micromanagers in history. The Church didn't just frown upon lust, it waged full-on war against it. And you, poor peasant, were on the losing side before you even took your pants off. At the centre of it all was the idea that sex, unless done strictly for procreation within marriage, was sinful. That meant no sex for fun, no sex out of wedlock, no sex while pregnant, during menstruation, after childbirth, before church services, or on one of the hundreds of religious feast days, which, fun fact, took up nearly half the calendar. Basically, if you wanted to have sex without risking eternal damnation, you had about 12 guilt-ridden Tuesdays a year to make it happen. The weirdest part. The Church got very specific about what was and wasn't okay. They published penitentials, books that were basically sin catalogues, written by monks who apparently had a little too much time and imagination. These guides would list sins of the flesh, alongside their corresponding punishments, often in exact numbers of days or even years of penance. For example, having sex in the wrong position might earn you 40 days of prayer and fasting. Committing adultery, that's 3 years. Oral sex? Forget it. You're on the fast track to hell. Now here's where things get awkward. The priests you confessed all this to? Yeah, they weren't always innocent themselves. A lot of them had mistresses, secret families, or very active imaginations about what other people were doing in bed. And sometimes they wrote it all down. Some clergy used confessionals as places to extract juicy gossip more than to offer forgiveness. And yes, many of them were male, so take a wild guess about which sins they emphasised more. Spoiler, it wasn't theft. Of course, this holy crusade against lust wasn't limited to the confessional booth. From the pulpit, priests thundered about temptation and purity. Lust, they said, was a disease. Women were its carriers, men were its victims. Which is honestly a bold take considering how often the men were the ones writing the sermons. Women were painted as dangerous, slippery creatures whose very presence could drive a man to ruin. Eve 2.0, but now with flaxen braids and a low-cut kirtle, and the messaging started early. Kids were warned about the dirtiness of their bodies. Teenagers were told that desire was a test from God, and even married couples were advised to abstain more often than not. The body, in the Church's eyes, was a burden. Pleasure, a trap. It's kind of amazing the human population didn't just fizzle out right there in the 12th century, but here's the thing. real life didn't always match the church's expectations. People still had sex, and not always within the sacred confines of wedlock. In fact, medieval records are full of complaints, lawsuits and punishments about fornication, adultery, and irregular unions. Some towns even had designated court days just to deal with sex-related offences. That's right. Once a month you could go down to the town square and watch your neighbours get publicly fined for banging the blacksmith's apprentice. One historian compared this system to sexual speed traps. The church knew people would mess up, and when they did, it cost them, sometimes in coin, sometimes in dignity. Fines, floggings, forced pilgrimages, public shaming, all part of the price of passion. And yet, people kept doing it, because, well, humans. There's a quirky little document from 11th century France where a bishop laments the sheer number of people having sex in cemeteries. Cemeteries. Not just once or twice, but apparently enough that he felt the need to write a strongly worded letter about it. So next time you feel like your love life is weird, just remember, somewhere out there, a monk had to invent rules about not doing it on top of Uncle Alfred's grave. And yet, even the bishops couldn't fully smother desire. Art, literature and folk songs from the era are full of innuendo. Pilgrims wrote bawdy poems, noble ladies passed secret love notes, farmers carved lewd carvings into church pews when the priest wasn't looking. There was even a trend of marginalia, those weird little illustrations in the edges of medieval books, where monks drew highly questionable scenes involving, for example, naked people jousting with gentle-shaped weapons. We're not making that up. Monastic boredom is a powerful force. This is where scholars start to disagree. Some argue that the church's control was absolute, that medieval sex was joyless and strictly utilitarian. Others say that, beneath the surface, people were sneakily carving out their own rules, ignoring the dogma when it suited them. It's hard to know for sure. Written records mostly come from elite or religious sources, who were obviously very invested in painting a certain picture. The horny peasants. They didn't leave behind diaries, too busy surviving, or sneaking off to the fields. So where does that leave you, dear medieval time traveller? Well, imagine trying to feel sexy with the looming threat of eternal fire hanging over your head. Imagine confessing to impure thoughts every Sunday, while the guy listening to you has 3 kids and a girlfriend in the next village. That's the kind of hypocrisy you're up against. Still, against all odds, people found moments of connection. Maybe a glance across the market, maybe a shared chore turns into a touch on the arm, maybe a lull in work offers 5 minutes of stolen time, and when those moments come, they burn brighter because they're rare, risky, and very much not allowed. So yeah, the church tried to say no, loudly, often, and with a lot of Latin. But the human body, it doesn't always listen, especially not when it's full of adrenaline, isolation, and the vague hope that nobody's watching. And if they are, you'll confess it on Sunday. You're standing at the entrance of a small village church, trying to remember if today's sermon was about gluttony or lust, when you hear the bells tolling. Not the ominous plague is here kind, just the usual someone's getting married clang. And that's your cue to witness one of the most important and least romantic rituals of medieval life, marriage. Not the candlelit, doves fluttering, I do sort of thing. No, this is marriage as contract, marriage as transaction, marriage as paperwork, but with more sheep. Let's get one thing straight right off the bat. You're not marrying for love. That's a cute modern idea that has absolutely no place in your current timeline. Marriage in the Middle Ages is about land, alliances, inheritance, and sometimes dowries. Those delightful bundles of property or livestock, or sometimes even cash, that a bride's family coughs up to seal the deal. If you're lucky, the person you're marrying smells okay and has most of their teeth. That's basically what passes for attraction in this context. You walk with the crowd toward the centre of the village, where the bride and groom stand awkwardly in front of the church. Not inside the church. Oh no, the ritual starts on the front steps. That's where everyone can see it, and more importantly, hear it. Witnesses are essential, because the only thing that makes this binding is the public exchange of consent. That's right. No priest required, no fancy ritual. You just had to say you agreed. Out loud, in front of people. Boom, you're married. Of course the church later tried to rein this in, insisting on clergy and ceremonies inside the church, but For a long time, a loud yes in the middle of town was enough to lock you into a lifelong union. Try ghosting your way out of that. Now here's where it gets weird, because despite all the religious oversight and endless rules about sex, medieval people had a pretty casual relationship with what counted as a real marriage. Hand fasting, for example, was common in certain areas, especially in Celtic traditions. Basically, two people clasped hands, exchanged vows, sometimes temporary, and considered themselves married, at least for a year and a day. If things didn't work out, they just didn't renew the vows. Divorce, medieval style. Of course, once the church got wind of this, they tried to tighten the rules. By the 12th century, marriage was being treated as a holy sacrament, something God himself had to approve of, and that meant the church needed to control it from the top down. No more spontaneous backyard weddings, no more trial periods, only permanent monogamous heterosexual unions, with sex strictly for procreation, naturally. And let's not forget the part where marrying a cousin might actually be the lawful thing to do if it kept land and bloodlines tidy. That brings us to cousin marriage, which, yes, was very real. Medieval society was obsessed with keeping wealth in the family, literally. Noble families often married within tight circles to protect titles and property. First cousins, no problem. Second cousins, practically strangers. The church technically frowned on it, citing spiritual kinship, but exceptions were made, especially if you were rich. Funny how that works. And while the upper classes were busy shuffling family trees into increasingly wobbly shapes, peasants usually married within their own small communities. Options were limited, to put it mildly. You married your neighbour's daughter, or your cousin's friend, because they lived within walking distance and your parents already knew theirs. Love didn't have much to do with it. Mutual toleration was often the best case scenario. On the big day, the bride's outfit might include a crown of flowers if she was lucky, or just her best linen shift if she wasn't. No big white dress, no organ music, and definitely no ring bearer toddling down the aisle. In fact, rings weren't required at all. If you exchanged a belt or a cup, that counted. Congratulations. You're now legally and spiritually shackled to someone who might not know how to read or bathe regularly. Once the vows were spoken, and the crowd mumbled a few amens, it was time for the bedding. That's exactly what it sounds like. A ritual in which the couple was led, or sometimes dragged, to the marriage bed while the entire community watched or waited just outside. The point was to make sure the marriage was consummated, because a marriage without sex didn't count. And yes, in many places and periods, there really were people who stood around to listen for the telltale noises or check the sheets afterward. In some noble households, a bishop might be present for this. That's right. Nothing says romance like a man in robes silently judging you from a corner chair. What if you didn't consummate the marriage? Then things got complicated. You could technically petition for an annulment, claiming the marriage was invalid because it hadn't been sealed. But you'd need witnesses, and let's just say medieval courts weren't exactly known for their sensitivity or discretion. On the other hand, faking consummation was also a thing. Smearing blood on the sheets, for example. Because of course, virginity mattered. A lot. Especially for women. We'll talk more about virginity later, but suffice it to say, women were expected to arrive at the altar intact, while men could stroll in with the sexual experience of a travelling bard. Double standards weren't just common. They were baked into the social, religious, and legal systems. And yet, for all the grim logistics and transactional nature of it, not all medieval marriages were cold arrangements. Some couples grew genuinely affectionate over time. There are letters and wills that hint at real tenderness. Wives left small personal items to their husbands, and husbands described their wives as beloved. That's no small thing in a world where you are more likely to die in childbirth than write a love poem. Still, for most people, marriage was duty. Your job was to produce children, manage the household, obey your spouse, if you were the wife, and make sure nobody suspected you were enjoying it too much. The church had no patience for pleasure, especially not within marriage. Sex was a necessary evil, even with your legally bonded partner. You were advised to pray afterward, or during, if you could manage it. Scholars still debate how much personal choice individuals actually had. In theory, both parties had to consent to the marriage, but in practice, family pressure, social norms, and sheer survival often overrode personal desire, especially for women who were usually married off by their early teens. Consent is a slippery term when your parents are standing behind you, holding your dowry like a loaded crossbow, and so here you are, standing in the crowd, watching two villagers clutch hands and say words they were probably told to memorise that morning. You're not sure if they even like each other, but the sheep have been transferred, the priest has nodded, and the bedding is about to begin. The town cheers. Someone throws a stale roll. The bride looks like she's trying not to cry. Welcome to marital bliss, 13th century style. You try to breathe through your nose, but that just makes it worse. The stench in the room is somewhere between boiled cabbage and damp wool left in the sun too long. You're at a feast, if you can call it that, sitting between a guy whose job is literally muckraker and a woman who smells vaguely of fermented goat. Everyone is chatting, drinking, laughing, and yes, absolutely reeking. Because in the Middle Ages, personal hygiene was more of a suggestion than a lifestyle, and it turns out that matters quite a bit when it comes to sex. Let's talk about bathing, or more accurately, the lack of it. Contrary to the myth that medieval people never bathed, the truth is more nuanced. They did bathe, just not often, and definitely not by modern standards. Public bathhouses existed, especially in towns and cities, and they were surprisingly popular for a while. Men and women sometimes bathed together, and it wasn't unheard of for those places to serve as casual dating or sex venues. But then, of course, the church stepped in and wagged a holy finger at anything that might involve nudity and pleasure in the same sentence. Slowly, bathhouses were shut down, and washing became more private, infrequent, and a lot colder. If you're poor, which you almost certainly are, you don't even have a tub. You wash your hands and face with cold water from a bucket, maybe once a week. Your laundry involves beating garments on rocks at the river, and full body washing? That's for special occasions like weddings or major holy days. Soap exists, but it's rough, made from animal fat and ashes, and it smells more like scorched bacon than anything floral. Shampoos and perfumes? Keep dreaming. Still, some people did care about how they smelled. There are recipes from the time for herbal washes, scented oils, and mouth rinses made from mint or vinegar. If you were rich, you might even dab a little rosewater on your wrists before entertaining guests. But even then, bathing was rare enough that people developed creative workarounds, like scented sachets sewn into clothing, or stuffing lavender into your undergarments, or just leaning into the musk and pretending it was natural manliness. And yet, despite the odds, sex kept happening. Human attraction, it seems, has a high tolerance for funk, but it definitely shaped expectations. If you're wondering why quick and quiet was the motto of many a medieval sex session, just imagine removing several layers of wool, linen and grime in a room with no heat and very thin walls. That's not foreplay, that's survival. What you wear under all those layers depends on your status. The average man might be rocking linen brays, basically medieval boxer shorts, while women wore long shifts. These weren't sexy so much as accessible. In fact, many couples didn't even fully undress during sex, just hoisted the necessary garments and got the job done. There's some evidence that noblewomen might have had breech gowns, dresses with a slit in just the right spot for efficiency. That's right, medieval lingerie, but make it utilitarian. And let's not forget the hair situation. Shaving wasn't really a thing for most people. Body hair was expected. Grooming tools existed. Tweezers, razors, combs, but they were luxury items. And even among the upper classes, removing body hair was more about health and cleanliness than beauty. Armpits, furry, legs, covered in layers anyway. Pubic hair, very much present. If you were expecting smooth, chiseled torsos and waxed elegance, you're several centuries too early. By now you're probably wondering, what about teeth? Oh, they had teeth. But dental hygiene was inconsistent. People chewed on twigs or rubbed ashes on their gums. Toothaches were common, and tooth loss in your 20s, not unusual. A smile full of crooked yellow teeth was just part of the package. Literally. Still, this is where the social split gets interesting. If you were a noble or wealthy merchant, you had more access to hygiene options. Hot water, perfumed soaps, soft cloths. Some even built small bathing rooms into their manors. Imagine a giant copper tub, filled by servants lugging buckets from the fireplace. You might soak once a month. Luxurious. And if you were entertaining a lover, maybe you even bathed first. Fancy. But among the working classes, bathing wasn't just rare, it was risky. Cold water could shock the system. Hot water took forever to prepare. and people genuinely believed that opening your pores made you more vulnerable to disease. That's why, during the Black Death, bathhouses were actually blamed for spreading illness. People locked themselves indoors and stopped washing altogether. Because nothing says plague prevention like layers of dried sweat and filth. Historians still debate how smelly the average person really was. Some say medieval people got used to each other's scent and didn't mind. Others argue that the stench must have been overwhelming to our modern noses. Probably both are true. There's even a theory that people's diets, less sugar, more herbs, meant their sweat smelled different. Not necessarily better, just different. Either way, deodorant wasn't a thing. You couldn't swipe a stick of Old Spice and call it a day. You just hoped that your natural musk didn't send your partner running. But here's a quirky detail. During certain feasts or festivals, people actually did make an effort. There are records of peasants bathing before big celebrations. Whole families would scrub down in shifts using the same tub of murky water. First the father, then the sons, then the mother, then the daughters, and finally the baby, who was now floating in everyone else's dirt. By the time it was your turn, the water looked like weak stew. Still, it was considered an upgrade. So, you're lying in bed now, trying to get close to your spouse without gagging on their breath, or noticing the trail of hay in their hair. There's affection, sure, maybe even a little excitement. But there's also that nagging awareness that nobody here has bathed since Candlemas, and yet, you go for it. Because love, lust, or just sheer boredom finds a way. You try not to breathe, too deeply. They do the same. It's mutual restraint and in its own weird way, kind of sweet. The candle flickers, the pigs snore, and somewhere outside the bathhouse stands empty, because the bishop said it's sinful and you said, I'm already halfway undressed. You're hunched over a wooden yoke, dragging a sloshing bucket of water from the village well, and you're exhausted, and it's not even noon yet. Your fingers are chapped, your lower back is screaming, and you've already dodged a suspiciously aggressive goose twice this morning. But before you can collapse in a pile of straw and defeat, your neighbour shoots you a quick grin and jerks his head toward the hayloft. It's subtle, casual, quick. You know exactly what he means. Because if you're a peasant in the Middle Ages, sex isn't about roses, candles, and hours of passionate romance. It's about opportunity and efficiency. Peasant sex, real, gritty, everyday medieval intimacy, was about as stripped down and practical as it gets. Most peasants lived in cramped one-room homes, shared with kids, in-laws, livestock, and the occasional neighbour who forgot to leave. Privacy? Not really an option. You might have a small wooden partition or maybe some hanging cloth for modesty, but more often than not, the only way to get alone with someone was to sneak away. Behind the barn, under a cart, in the fields during planting season. You made do with what you had, and if you got caught, well, that depended on who caught you. Daily life for a peasant was brutal. Sunrise to sunset, it was non-stop labour. Milking, ploughing, planting, cooking, cleaning, brewing ale, chasing chickens, mending clothes, digging ditches, hauling water, and trying not to die of dysentery. The only real downtime came after dark, and even then your body ached so much that rolling over in bed felt like an act of war against your joints. So sex, when it happened, had to squeeze itself into these tiny slivers of quiet. It wasn't always romantic, but it was deeply human. There's something oddly touching about it, honestly. Two tired people, bodies aching and covered in dirt, curled together on a straw mattress, whispering nonsense in the dark while someone snores 3 feet away. It's not glamorous, but it's real, and sometimes it's the only intimacy they get all week. Of course, the church still loomed large, even over the peasant bedroom or haystack. Technically, any sexual activity outside of marriage was a sin. But let's be real. The local priest probably knew who was sneaking around. He might even be sneaking around himself. Enforcement of these rules was wildly inconsistent. In some villages, you'd be fined for fornication. In others, people just shrugged and looked the other way, especially if both parties were eventually going to marry anyway. That said, if a pregnancy occurred outside of marriage, things got complicated fast. Illegitimacy was a big deal, mostly because of property rights and inheritance, which weren't even relevant to most peasants. Still, shame and gossip could ruin someone's life. A pregnant, unmarried woman might be forced to name the father in front of the entire village. He'd then either marry her or be publicly punished. Or deny everything. Either way, not great. One quirky workaround? friar marriages. These were informal unions performed by travelling friars, often without official documentation. Poor couples used them to legitimise relationships when they couldn't afford a proper church wedding. Convenient and scandalous, depending on who you asked. And what about love? It existed, sure, but peasants didn't marry because of love. They married because they needed help on the farm, or because their parents arranged it, or because the woman was already pregnant and the village elders were tired of the whispers. Still, companionship sometimes blossomed into affection. There are songs and stories from the time that hint at genuine romantic attachment. Simple, earthy, and grounded in shared struggle. It wasn't courtly love. It was, "You didn't let the cow step on my foot today, love." One historical curiosity: there's evidence that some peasants practiced a form of temporary cohabitation before marriage. Basically, try before you buy. Couples would live together unofficially for a while, sometimes even have a child, and only then marry if things worked out. The church hated this, of course, but it was common enough that local customs accommodated it. Practicality always had a way of winning. Now, about contraception. The church banned it outright, but that didn't stop peasants from trying. They weren't idiots, they knew how babies happened, and they knew how to try to prevent them. You'll hear more about that in a later section, but let's just say sheep intestines weren't just for dinner. For now, picture yourself kneeling on scratchy straw in the corner of a storage shed, trying to keep your clothes mostly on while someone you like but don't love awkwardly fumbles with your belt ties. There's no candlelight, no soft music, just the sound of distant chickens and your own heartbeat. You both know it has to be quick. Someone could walk in and chores wait for no one. It's not perfect, but it's something. And honestly, in a life ruled by toil and tedium, that brief moment of skin on skin feels like a stolen treasure. The scholarly debate here is interesting. Some argue that peasant sex was strictly functional, about producing children, not pleasure. But others point out that these people weren't emotionless work robots. They sang bawdy songs, they told dirty jokes, they carved obscene graffiti into church pews. Clearly, the urge for connection, for pleasure, for mischief was alive and well, even in the mud. And don't let the idea of medieval peasant fool you into thinking these folks were prudish or clueless. In some ways, they were more direct about sex than we are. They had no social media filters, no curated identities. Life was short and raw, and sex was just another part of surviving it. You finish your bucket duties and trudge back to your cottage. Inside, your spouse is elbow deep in bread dough, humming something soft and tuneless. You exchange a glance and there's no dramatic swoon, but there's understanding. You've got 2 children, a roof that leaks, and a cow that keeps breaking fences. But maybe tonight, after the kids fall asleep and the fire goes out, you'll find a quiet moment. Just long enough to remind yourselves that you're not just labourers or parents or sinners. You're still people, still bodies, still reaching for something warm in a world that rarely offers it. The stone floor is cold beneath your bare feet as you step into the castle hallway. Somewhere, a harp is playing a melancholy tune, the notes drifting faintly through the corridors like perfume. You pass a tapestry of St. George slaying a suspiciously bored-looking dragon and push open a heavy wooden door. Welcome to the noble's bedroom. Well, one of them. There's probably another 2 or 3 scattered around the estate, and your host likely doesn't sleep in the same one every night. That's the thing about sex among the nobility. It's less about romance and more about property, bloodlines, and power. Lots and lots of power. The first thing you notice is the bed. It's enormous, draped in layers of velvet and furs, framed by intricately carved posts, and covered in so many pillows you're not sure where the actual mattress begins. There are servants bustling about, fluffing, tucking, warming bricks to place at the foot, because heaven forbid the Lord's toes get cold. This isn't a bedroom so much as a performance space, and the main act, producing heirs. Unlike the peasants, who could get away with a quick roll in the hay without anyone noticing, nobles had their sex lives watched and recorded like state affairs, because they were state affairs. If you're a nobleman, every child you father could inherit land, titles, or diplomatic alliances. If you're a noblewoman, your body is basically a political tool, designed to bear sons and strengthen dynasties. Romantic, huh? But don't confuse formality with fidelity. Noble marriages were rarely about love, and almost never about exclusivity. Affairs were common, in some courts, expected, in others, strategic. If your husband was off fighting a crusade, which statistically he was, you might take a lover to keep yourself entertained. Just, discreetly. And as long as you didn't produce any suspiciously dark-haired babies in a family full of blondes, no one asked too many questions. One particularly spicy example comes from 14th century France, where Queen Isabella's sisters-in-law were accused of having affairs with knights. The scandal exploded when someone snitched. The women were arrested, and 2 unlucky knights were executed in a very public and very gruesome way. Their mistake? Not being subtle enough. Court gossip was brutal, and once rumours took hold, it didn't matter whether they were true. If you were a man of status, though, your extramarital activities were more or less tolerated. Kings kept mistresses as a matter of course. Even lower nobles were known to maintain unofficial wives on the side, women who might receive gifts, housing, and even financial support in exchange for their companionship. The church scolded it, of course, but rarely with teeth. Powerful men weren't punished, they were just passionate. There's a weird, uncomfortable double standard here. Noblemen's sexual appetites were treated as natural, even healthy. Noble women's, dangerous. If a woman was too flirtatious or too eager, she risked being labelled a seductress, or worse, a witch. Female desire in general was something to be feared, controlled, and, when possible, locked behind embroidery hoops and 6 layers of velvet. Still, noble women found ways to carve out slivers of autonomy. Some wielded their sexuality like a weapon, strategically aligning with powerful lovers. Others used charm to influence husbands or gain access to court politics. And a few flat-out rebelled, refusing to marry or choosing lovers on their own terms. These women were rare, often scandalous, and occasionally legendary. Now, let's talk logistics. Noble sex could be surprisingly theatrical. There are records of bedding ceremonies, similar to what peasants experienced, only far more elaborate. Guests would walk the newlyweds to the bedroom, sing bawdy songs, and sometimes even stay to witness the consummation. Yes, witness. Imagine trying to perform under pressure with half the court pretending not to stare from behind a velvet curtain. Of course, not every encounter involved the full royal parade. There were stolen moments too. Lovers sneaking into each other's rooms, secret passages used for romantic rendezvous, cryptic letters delivered by trusted servants. One scholar even uncovered a set of erotic poems exchanged between a noblewoman and her steward. They're crude, heartfelt, and surprisingly explicit. Who knew the medieval elite had a flair for sexting? In rhymed couplets. Now for the scholarly debate. Some argue that noblewomen were little more than pawns, traded like property between powerful families. Others suggest they had more agency than we give them credit for, using wit, charm, and sheer survival instincts to navigate a world stacked against them. It's probably both. Some women were powerless, others played the game and played it well. But none of them had the luxury of disengaging entirely. Here's a quirky fact to toss into the mix. Some noble households employed bed warmers, not the brick kind. These were actual human servants, sometimes women, sometimes young men, whose job was to warm the bed with their bodies before the noble arrived. Did that ever turn into something more? Oh, absolutely. Nobles breaking social boundaries with servants is practically its own subgenre of medieval scandal. Just don't tell the bishop. And speaking of clergy, noble families often had a private chaplain who doubled as a confessor, which meant that every sin, every indiscretion, every tangled bedfellow had to be whispered to someone who, ideally, wouldn't use it as leverage. Ideally. But in a court where gossip was currency, that was a dangerous bet. You lean against the wall, watching a young lord being helped out of his embroidered doublet by 3 bored-looking servants. His wife is across the room, yawning into a goblet of wine. They'll lie together tonight, perhaps even sleep in the same bed, but neither is expecting fireworks. This isn't passion, this is obligation. They're here to maintain a bloodline signified by a signed charter, and a family crest featuring an angry-looking eagle. Still, every now and then something surprising happened. Real love. A noble couple who genuinely liked each other, who shared inside jokes, wrote letters when apart, and maybe even enjoyed each other's company in bed. These stories are rare, but they exist, hidden in dusty correspondence and surviving poetry. One countess referred to her husband as her sun and shield. A duke begged his wife to forgive his absence, saying he missed the feel of her hand on his face. For a brief moment, beneath the layers of ceremony and politics, something tender flickers. And then, of course, it's time to produce another heir. The midwife is summoned. The servants prepare the birthing room. The lady clenches her jaw. The cycle continues. In this world, sex isn't just personal, it's dynastic. And you're just passing through, trying not to get caught loitering near a nobleman's bedchamber. Careful. That kind of curiosity has a way of ending badly, sometimes in chains, sometimes in poetry. You duck beneath a stone archway and step into the bustling heart of a medieval city. Maybe Paris, maybe Florence, maybe London, depending on how much cobblestone your boots can handle. Everything here feels louder, faster, and slightly more dangerous than in the countryside. Market stalls spill onto narrow alleys, hawkers shout over each other, chamber pots fly out of windows with very little warning, and if you're looking for something, or someone, you'll probably find them here, including sex. Because unlike the rural villages where privacy was non-existent and options were slim, urban centres in the Middle Ages offered a different kind of opportunity. A little anonymity, a little chaos, and a whole lot of temptation. You've barely taken 10 steps before you pass a flirtatious merchant girl leaning over a basket of apples with just a little too much enthusiasm. Down the next alley, a pair of apprentices laugh while ogling a woman walking by in a scandalously short hem, meaning, you can see her ankles, scandalous. And tucked between a fishmonger and a bookbinder's shop, there's a discreet door with a red cloth hanging from the knob. That's not laundry, that's a signal. You've just wandered into the world of city sex where rules still exist, but they're easier to bend. Unlike the countryside where everyone knows your name, your parents' names, and probably the last time you got caught behind a hay bale, cities offered a degree of freedom. For young people especially, moving to a city meant escaping the crushing weight of parental oversight and church gossip. It was your chance to start fresh, reinvent yourself, make mistakes in private, or at least among strangers, and that's exactly what a lot of people did. Apprentices and servants, arriving in droves to work in shops and homes, often found themselves living in cramped quarters with others their age. Proximity leads to familiarity, and familiarity leads to a whole lot of, oops, we were just practicing how to lace bodices. Relationships happened quickly, sometimes secretly, and not always with any intention of marriage. But the church hadn't given up. City clergy were everywhere, preaching, writing moral pamphlets, and making weekly rounds to ask invasive questions. And yet, enforcement was patchy. Some bishops turned a blind eye, some demanded fines, and others made examples out of offenders. If you were unlucky enough to get caught having carnal relations outside of marriage, you could be forced to do public penance, barefoot in your underclothes holding a candle, while the town watched you walk in shame. Other times, it was just a fine or a warning. It really depended on how well connected you were. And here's a fun twist. Some city courts allowed couples to argue that they were married by consent. If two people had exchanged vows privately, even without a priest, and then consummated the relationship, that could count as a valid marriage. So naturally, lots of people claimed they'd said the vows after they got caught. No, we're totally married. We just forgot to invite witnesses. Women in cities had a little more wiggle room than their rural counterparts. Some worked as shopkeepers, midwives, or even small-scale landlords. A few ran taverns or bathhouses, places that often doubled as semi-discreet hookup spots. Female autonomy was still limited, but the anonymity of city life let them carve out space for themselves, and for relationships that weren't always sanctioned. Now, if you were wealthy, city love could be a little more elegant. Well-born daughters were closely guarded, kept indoors, watched by chaperones, and expected to marry strategically. But they still found ways to flirt, passing notes via servants, exchanging gifts, or slipping suggestive lines into otherwise innocent poetry. One young Italian noblewoman famously sent her suitor a pair of gloves, scented with lavender and sealed with wax. The message? I want you to touch me, but only under 3 layers of decorum. For the not-so-wealthy, love was less subtle. Inns and taverns became breeding grounds, figuratively and sometimes literally, for casual sex and quick romances. A tankard of ale, a few shared laughs, and suddenly you're whispering in a dark corner while your friends pretend not to notice. In one 14th century record from Dijon, a tavern owner was fined for hosting nightly dancing and too much joy. which, let's be honest, is just bureaucratic code for everyone was getting it on and someone tattled. A quirky fact here: some cities had designated love lanes, or secluded gardens where couples could sneak off for privacy. In Paris, there was even a place called La Rue des Mauvaises Paroles, literally the street of bad words. You can guess what kind of conversations happened there. Of course, sex in the city wasn't always consensual or safe. The same anonymity that allowed freedom also created risk. Predatory behaviour was common, especially among powerful men who saw servant girls or apprentices as easy targets. Legal protections were weak, and the burden of proof almost always fell on the woman. Sometimes she'd be blamed for seducing him, other times she'd be shamed for not screaming loud enough. It was a brutal double bind, and one that rarely ended with justice. Yet amid the risk and chaos, there was also a strange sort of resilience. City dwellers developed their own codes of conduct, their own reputations, their own whispered networks. If someone was dangerous, word got around. If someone was kind or generous or good in bed, that got around too. People talked. They always have. One ongoing scholarly debate centres on how women navigated this urban sexual landscape. Were they constantly victimised, or did they find subtle ways to assert control? The answer, like most things in history, is both. Some women were exploited, manipulated, or abandoned. Others were sharp, strategic, and socially savvy, able to manage their lovers, dodge scandal, and build small empires in back rooms and side alleys. You finish walking the length of the street, sidestepping an open drain and the occasional rat, and duck into a candlelit tavern where the air smells like spiced wine and warm bread. At a corner table, two people lean close, their knees touching beneath the table. You can't hear what they're saying, but you catch the flicker of a smile, the tilt of a head, the unmistakable spark of something just beginning. Maybe it'll end in marriage, maybe in heartbreak, maybe in a scandal that gets written up in next week's court records. Or maybe they'll just disappear into the night and never speak again. That's the beauty and the danger of medieval city love. It's fast, it's fragile, and it's very, very human. You're crouched in the shadows of a crumbling stone wall, the scent of beeswax and old incense thick in your nose as a pair of hooded figures slip silently through the cloister. One disappears into the herb garden, the other lingers by the statue of St. Agnes, glancing around before vanishing into a door you hadn't even noticed. It clicks shut. And just like that, you've stumbled onto one of the worst-kept secrets of the medieval church. Monks and nuns were definitely not always celibate. Now, in theory, religious life meant total abstinence. You took vows, poverty, obedience, chastity, and you renounced all worldly pleasures, including sex. Monks and nuns were supposed to devote themselves fully to God. The body was a vessel of sin. Desire was a distraction. The cloister, with its silence and solitude, was designed to keep temptation far, far away. In practice, that door you just saw was probably hiding a tryst, or a love letter, or both. Let's start with monks. Picture a monastery nestled in a quiet forest or perched on a hill overlooking a sleepy village. Inside, dozens of men in wool robes copy manuscripts, grow vegetables, chant prayers, and, occasionally, get very curious about each other. Same-sex encounters between monks were not unheard of, and church records are full of cases where brothers were caught in scandalous embrace or showing excessive fondness. The punishments varied from fasting and prayer to expulsion, depending on who got caught and how angry the abbot felt that day. But it wasn't just men. Nuns had their own share of secrets. Convents were supposed to be places of seclusion and safety, but they were also full of smart, capable women who, for various reasons, had been denied a more traditional life. Some had been sent there by their families to avoid dowries. Others joined willingly, seeking education or independence, and some just didn't want to get married. Regardless of why they were there, desire didn't vanish at the gate. Letters survive, passionate, poetic, often coded, between nuns and their lovers. Sometimes those lovers were priests, monks, or even noblemen. Other times the intimacy was shared between the nuns themselves. In one particularly juicy scandal from the 14th century, a group of French nuns was accused of lying together improperly and sneaking out of the convent at night. Church investigators were appalled. The sisters apparently were not. Then there's the phenomenon of spiritual marriages, deep, emotionally intense relationships between monks and nuns, or monks and monks, nuns and nuns, that were officially non-sexual but, let's be honest, probably not always as chaste as advertised. These relationships were often justified in spiritual terms, soul-bonded, united in Christ, and so on. But the language in some of the surviving letters gets pretty suggestive. Think Song of Songs meets long-distance medieval flirting. One of the most famous examples comes from the letters of Abelard and Heloise, a philosopher and his student-turned-lover-turned-nun. Their romance is legendary, tender, tragic, and intellectually electric. After their affair was discovered, and Abelard was famously castrated by her angry relatives, Heloise entered a convent. But their correspondence continued for years, full of longing and philosophical debates about love, faith and desire. Heloise, in particular, refused to pretend that her desire had simply disappeared with her veil. "Even in sleep," she once wrote, "my thoughts are of you." That tension between body and soul, between vows and craving, is one of the most fascinating parts of monastic sexuality. Some monks wrote entire treatises wrestling with impure thoughts, penning painfully honest confessions about dreams, fantasies, or the torment of resisting desire. Others just gave in. There are records of monks bribing gatekeepers to admit women into the cloister under cover of night. One monastery in Italy was even temporarily shut down after it was discovered that the monks had converted an entire wing into private love dens. Monastic Tinder, if you will. Of course, not all these relationships were consensual. Abuse of power happened inside religious walls just as much as outside them. A young novice might be pressured by an older monk. A visiting priest might use confession as an opportunity to pry, manipulate, or worse. And in many cases, the victims had no one to turn to. Reporting a crime meant admitting to sin, and punishments were rarely fair. This brings us to a long-standing scholarly debate. Were monasteries and convents hotbeds of secret sex and scandal, or are we just fascinated by the few dramatic cases that made it into the records? Some argue that the majority of religious life was in fact celibate and deeply spiritual. Others point out that the human body doesn't stop being human just because you put on a robe and swear an oath. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. Most monks and nuns tried to stay chaste, but a significant number, well, tried and failed. A quirky historical detail, there are documented cases of nuns giving birth in convents. When asked about the pregnancies, some claimed they'd been visited by angels. Others said demons. One nun swore she had swallowed a piece of cursed bread that made her belly swell. The church, unsurprisingly, wasn't buying it. Neither were the midwives. And then there were the escapees, monks and nuns who literally climbed the walls to be with someone they loved. In 15th century England, a nun named Joan of Leeds faked her own death, staged a burial using a dummy, and ran away with a lover. The bishop eventually tracked her down and demanded her return. Whether she obeyed? Historians are still arguing about it. You slip back behind a stone column as the cloister door creaks open again. The same hooded figure glances round, brushing a smudge of red from their cheek, lip rouge maybe, or just a berry from the garden. They vanish into the shadows, robe rustling, faintly. Somewhere nearby, a bell tolls for vespers. Another day of prayer begins. But behind the monastery walls, behind the veil of piety and ritual, the same old human stories play out. Love, lust, secrecy, regret. You're left wondering how many whispered vows were really for God, and how many were for each other. You're flipping through a thick, crumbling manuscript by candlelight, and the first thing that catches your eye is a sentence that says something like, "He who mounts his wife from behind shall fast for 40 days. Wait, what? You squint closer. Yep, that's what it says. Welcome to the wild, deeply uncomfortable and oddly bureaucratic world of medieval sin charts. Because when it came to sex, the church didn't just disapprove from the pulpit, it documented everything, extensively, in mind-numbing, weirdly specific detail. These weren't just lists of things not to do, they were penitentials, thick, monk-authored manuals that spelled out every possible sin of the flesh, along with the exact punishment it required. And we mean exact. These guys didn't just have categories, they had subcategories, charts, multipliers. It's like someone gave your high school vice principal a spreadsheet and told him to go nuts. You did it on a holy day? That's double penance. You had sex standing up? That's unnatural and earns you 20 lashes and 40 days of barley-only meals. You made eye contact with your spouse while doing it and felt joy. That's pride, friend, and you'll want to schedule some extra prayer time. The penitentials were a medieval mix of theology, surveillance, and the kind of obsessive cataloguing that can only come from someone who hasn't touched another person in a decade. The logic behind all this was rooted in one key idea. Sex is only okay if it's within marriage and solely for the purpose of procreation. Anything that strays from that narrow lane, any pleasure, any creativity, any enthusiasm, was automatically suspect. So naturally the monks had to define all the ways people could mess it up, in vivid, sometimes hilariously awkward detail. Some of the best examples come from Irish and Anglo-Saxon sources. You'll find stuff like, if a man lies with his wife and does not complete the act but spills his seed, he shall do penance for 3 days. Or, if he inserts but does not thrust, 1 day's penance. It's like a poorly written instruction manual for a blender, but the blender is your soul. And it wasn't just heterosexual acts they were policing. Oh no. The penitentials went after everything. Masturbation, an abominable act, oral sex, against nature, and, especially, any same-sex behaviour, which was always punished more harshly. The church was nothing if not consistent in its fear of anything that hinted at pleasure outside its strict framework. You wanted to kiss your spouse anywhere but the lips? Hope you enjoy reciting all 150 psalms every day for a week. Now here's a fringe fact that'll make you blink. There was actually debate among some church authorities over whether it was better to have sex with your spouse in lust, or with a prostitute but without desire. Think about that. Some argued that it was less sinful to commit adultery without enjoying it than to love your spouse too much in bed. That's how allergic they were to pleasure. They weren't trying to ruin your fun. They thought fun was the problem in the first place. To be fair, some of these penitentials were intended as guides for priests hearing confessions. They weren't always meant to be read by the general public, but the sheer fact that these documents exist, and that they were copied, preserved, and distributed, tells you how seriously the church took its role as the moral micromanager of medieval bedrooms. And while it's easy to laugh now, there's something deeply unsettling about it too. Because all this record-keeping wasn't just theoretical. People were punished based on these rules. A married couple who got too creative could be fined or forced to fast. Someone accused of impure thoughts might be made to do penance that lasted for weeks, months, even years. And because a lot of these acts were private, suspicion alone could land you in hot water. You didn't just have to behave. You had to look like someone who behaved. That's where it gets Orwellian. There was no such thing as a private life. The church taught that God saw everything, and so should your confessor. You were expected to admit to things you might not even know were sins. Imagine being told, by the way, you committed a grave offence last Tuesday night. What? Don't explain. Just start fasting. Of course, enforcement varied wildly depending on region, time period, and the temperament of your local priest. Some were strict, some lenient. Some wanted full confessions, while others were more concerned with making sure the villagers showed up for mass. Still, the ever-present threat of spiritual consequences kept a lot of people nervous, and a lot of bedrooms colder than they had to be. Interestingly, not everyone in the church agreed with this approach. Some more progressive theologians, yes, they existed, argued that marital intimacy, when loving and mutual, wasn't sinful at all. A few even suggested that pleasure within marriage could be a gift from God. But these voices were often drowned out by the louder, fire and brimstone types who thought you should feel bad for sneezing on a Sunday. There's still debate among scholars about how seriously people took these penitentials. Did they internalise the guilt? Or did they nod, say, "Yes, Father," and go right back to their favourite position? Probably both. Like with any rules-based system, the devout followed the rules. The rest found loopholes, or at least good excuses. And here's the thing. Even in the face of all this control, desire didn't go away. It just got sneakier. People didn't stop fantasizing. They just whispered their fantasies to each other in the dark, or scribbled them in margins, or turned them into coded folk songs passed from village to village. If anything, the rigid rules made those desires more exciting, taboo, forbidden, deliciously dangerous. You close the penitential book and exhale. It smells like mould and moral panic. The candle's low now, casting long shadows across the stone walls. Somewhere outside, a couple is probably breaking at least 3 of the listed rules, and they won't be confessing anytime soon. Not because they're rebellious, but because they're human, and no chart, no matter how detailed, can fully map the contours of real desire. The door creaks open slowly, revealing a woman in a linen gown, sleeves rolled up, apron stained with something that might be broth, or maybe blood. You can't quite tell. She's not what you expected. Not elderly, not bent over a cane, and definitely not quiet. She's sharp-eyed, quick-handed, and busy cutting roots on a table littered with herbs, twine, and something that looks suspiciously like a preserved rabbit's foot. This is the village midwife. And if there's one person in the entire medieval world who knows more about sex, bodies, birth, and scandal than anyone else, including your priest, it's her. Midwives were the keepers of secret knowledge. You wouldn't find them in libraries or university halls, those were closed off to women, but you'd find them in every town and village, whispering with mothers-to-be, treating infections, setting bones, and yes, listening to everything. Want to know who's pregnant before their wedding? Ask the midwife. Who's using sheep bladder condoms? She knows. Who has that rash that definitely isn't from the Lord's punishment? Oh, she's seen it 3 times this week. The church had a complicated relationship with midwives. On the one hand, they were essential. Men weren't allowed in birthing rooms, so someone had to handle the actual process of bringing new souls into the world. On the other hand, midwives wielded knowledge that wasn't always under ecclesiastical control. They knew what herbs could ease labour. They knew how to end pregnancies discreetly and quietly, and they knew how to keep secrets. That made them powerful, and in a suspicious society, potentially dangerous. You sit on a stool near the fire as the midwife brews something thick and bitter-smelling in a blackened pot. She chats while she works, one eye on the kettle and one on your posture. She corrects the way you're sitting without asking. "That's how hips get misaligned," she mutters. "Seen it too many times." You nod quickly, trying to look like you weren't about to ask if that rabbit foot is for fertility or stew. Midwives weren't just baby catchers. They were sex educators, relationship counsellors, healers, and, when needed, sorceresses. If a woman came to her with irregular bleeding, she knew what questions to ask. If a man had a swelling he couldn't explain, she had a poultice ready before he could finish his sentence. And if a teenage girl was panicking after a missed cycle, the midwife didn't panic. She had tea and options. One of the most fascinating and hotly debated topics among historians is just how much reproductive control medieval women actually had. Officially, of course, contraception was forbidden. The church labelled it a sin. But unofficially, midwives had recipes passed down through generations, made from herbs like pennyroyal, rue, or Queen Anne's lace, that acted as contraceptives or abortifacients. Were they reliable? Not always. Were they dangerous? Sometimes. But they were real, and women used them, especially under the guidance of someone who knew what she was doing. That's where the friction came in. The church hated that these women had so much unsupervised authority over something as sacred, read politicised, as childbirth. So midwives were sometimes accused of witchcraft, especially if anything went wrong. If a baby died during birth, or a woman hemorrhaged, or someone gossiped too loudly, a midwife could find herself under suspicion. It didn't help that many of them used charms, prayers, and rituals that blended folk magic with Christian language. One moment she's muttering a blessing over a birth stool. The next, someone's whispering that she consorts with demons. Still, for most medieval women, the midwife was a trusted figure. She was the only one who would listen without judgment, the only one who'd seen it all before, the only one who could look at a scared 15-year-old girl and say, "You're not the first and you won't be the last. Let's sort it out." She was also a vital presence during labour itself, a brutal, dangerous process with no anaesthetic, no surgical tools, and a very real chance of death. The midwife knew how to rotate a breech baby by hand, how to stop a hemorrhage with hot cloths and pressure, how to cut a cord and stitch a tear. If the baby didn't breathe right away, she knew how to breathe for it. If the mother didn't survive, she prepared the body, wrapped the child, and said the necessary words. No male doctor, rare as they were, could do all that. In fact, medieval medical schools often excluded women entirely, so midwives weren't formally trained in the academic sense, but they had apprenticeships, traditions, and hands-on experience that often made them more effective than male physicians, especially when it came to sex and childbirth, topics most male scholars understood only in theory. The uterus, in some university diagrams, was literally drawn as a little oven. Midwives knew better. They'd held one. Well, not literally, but close enough. Here's a strange but fascinating fringe fact. Some midwives were called in to inspect the virginity of brides before marriage. That's right, pre-wedding hymen checks. A woman's value, especially among the nobility, was often tied to her chastity, and if there was doubt, a midwife would be brought in to verify. The science, of course, was non-existent. But the social stakes were deadly serious. A failed test could mean disgrace, annulment, even violence, and whether the midwife told the truth or told the bride what she needed to hear, well, that depended on the midwife. Back in the cottage, the brew is ready. The midwife pours a little into a clay cup, blows on it, and hands it to a pale, anxious-looking girl sitting by the fire. The girl sips, winces, then drinks the rest. The midwife squeezes her hand once, firmly. "Rest," she says. "Let it work." You stay quiet. You're not sure if the girl is ending a pregnancy, managing a painful one, or just trying to delay the next. But you are sure of this. The midwife knows exactly what she's doing. She's done it 100 times before. She'll do it 100 more. And while the church thunders from its pulpits about purity and obedience, this woman works in the shadows, wielding knowledge the priests don't understand and probably fear. She's the reason more women survive childbirth. She's the reason some didn't have to face it at all. And though she'll never be canonized or quoted in a university, she knows more about the messy, real, physical side of medieval sex than any theologian ever will. The fire crackles, the herbs simmer, and outside the church bells ring. You step carefully through the back door of an apothecary, trying not to knock over the rows of jars crowding the shelves, some labelled with things like rue, mugwort and goat bile, and others left mysteriously blank. A cat is sleeping in a basket of dried moss. Something smells sharply of vinegar, and something else smells, suspiciously like despair. You're here to find out how medieval people prevented pregnancy, or tried to, and it turns out they were surprisingly creative, resourceful, and occasionally downright reckless. First off, let's state the obvious. The church was absolutely unequivocally against any form of contraception. Officially, sex was for making babies, not for fun. Any effort to prevent pregnancy, herbs, barriers, magical spells, was labelled sinful, unnatural, and punishable by everything from penance to excommunication. That didn't stop anyone. It just meant they got sneakier. You pick up a tiny pouch hanging from a nail and give it a sniff. It's filled with something bitter and dusty, probably a mix of dried herbs. This would have been tucked under a mattress or worn on a string around the waist. Part folk magic, part deodorant, part contraceptive talisman. Did it work? Probably not. But in a world where formal science didn't have much to offer, you'd try anything. Actual practical birth control in the Middle Ages came in several forms, many of which involved ingredients you probably wouldn't want anywhere near your reproductive organs. There were herbal pessaries, small balls of plant matter soaked in vinegar or wine, inserted into the vagina to block or kill sperm. Some recipes included wool soaked in honey and salt or mashed dates mixed with tree resin. Effective? Occasionally. Comfortable? Absolutely not. And then, of course, there were condoms. Yes, they existed. Crude, awkward, and a logistical nightmare, but they existed. Early condoms were typically made from animal intestines, usually sheep or goat, tied off at one end and fastened with a little ribbon. They were expensive and reused, yes, reused, often washed between uses like you'd rinse out a sock. Some even came with instructions, like the 16th century Italian syphilis sheaths, meant to prevent the spread of disease. But even in earlier medieval times, there's evidence of similar barrier methods being used, especially among sex workers and travellers. They were less about birth control and more about avoiding, let's say, unpleasant surprises. One particularly odd but well-documented contraceptive method: potions. These range from mildly herbal to straight-up toxic. You'd find concoctions brewed from pennyroyal, rue, wild carrot, also known as Queen Anne's lace, and even mercury. Women would drink teas, chew leaves, or soak cloth in the mixture and use it internally. Some of these plants do have properties that can interfere with pregnancy. Others can interfere with your liver, or your entire existence. And here's where things get dicey. Because without proper dosage knowledge or medical oversight, the line between contraception and poison was razor thin. Some women suffered permanent damage, others died, but the desperation to control fertility outweighed the risks. especially in a world where pregnancy was as dangerous as it was constant. You couldn't just choose to have 2 kids and stop. You were expected to keep producing until your body gave out, you ran out of food, or both. Now, let's talk about who was using these methods. Contrary to popular belief, it wasn't just prostitutes or fallen women. Married women too sought ways to control the size of their families. Midwives and wise women often quietly passed recipes and techniques between generations. This was intimate, forbidden knowledge, spoken softly, scrawled in margins, memorized and never written down. If you got caught, you could be accused of practicing witchcraft or interfering with God's will. But if you didn't control your fertility, you might find yourself with 12 mouths to feed and no bread. One case from 14th century France records a woman accused of mixing herbs to block conception. Her accuser, a jealous neighbour. Her punishment, public penance, a hefty fine, and forced confession. But no one stopped coming to her afterward. The line outside her door just got quieter. A quirky little fact: some birth. Control methods involved chanting prayers backward or performing specific acts under certain moon phases. Yes, really. Medieval people blended religion and folk magic constantly, even when those things technically contradicted each other. You might recite a psalm while tying a knot in a cord, believing that as long as the knot stayed tied, so would your womb. The spiritual and the physical were never far apart. Scholars debate how widespread these methods really were. Some argue that the average medieval woman had very little control over her reproductive life. Others insist that the prevalence of midwifery, herbal knowledge, and oral tradition suggests a quiet but persistent culture of resistance. The truth likely varies by region, class, and access. A noblewoman might use discreet herbs provided by her private healer. A peasant might rely on her neighbour's sister who once spent time in a convent. What's clear is that people tried. They tried very, very hard. And while the church clung tightly to its doctrine, not everyone inside it agreed. There are occasional records of sympathetic priests looking the other way, or nuns quietly sharing remedies with female relatives. After all, even religious women had sisters, nieces, cousins, and even they could see what endless pregnancy did to a body. Outside the apothecary, the young woman waits, her shawl pulled tightly over her head. The apothecary meets her at the door, presses something wrapped in cloth into her palm, and murmurs a few instructions. She nods once and disappears down the alley. You don't know if it's for contraception, miscarriage, or just a really intense stomachache. That's the thing about this knowledge. It moves in whispers. It's easy to assume that the medieval world was black and white when it came to sex and reproduction, but the truth is messier. Much messier. Yes, the rules were harsh. Yes, the risks were high. But the instinct to control one's own body, to say when, how, and with whom, has always been there. Even when it meant boiling roots in secret, even when it meant slipping a charm under your pillow and hoping for the best. The cat in the basket yawns. The apothecary returns to grinding something that smells like rosemary and crushed hope. Outside, the bells ring for vespers. Inside, a jar is labelled "Do Not Touch." You resist the urge. You're kneeling at the edge of a narrow stone bed, watching a young woman in a too-tight linen gown stare at her reflection in a bucket of water. She's biting her lip, smoothing her hair, trying not to look nervous. Tomorrow is her wedding day, and tonight she's being reminded quite firmly and by every aunt, cousin, neighbour and priest in a 10-mile radius that she'd better be a virgin when she steps under that altar. Welcome to one of the most anxiety-ridden obsessions of the medieval world: virginity. Not just any virginity, female virginity. Let's be clear, no one's marching up to the groom and asking for a certificate of chastity or a pre-wedding inspection. Male experience was tolerated, even expected in some circles. But for women, virginity was currency, proof of purity, proof of honour, proof that a woman belonged first to her father and then to her husband, untouched and untainted, like a loaf of bread no one's sliced yet. It sounds harsh because it was, and it wasn't just about reputation, it was about land, legitimacy and bloodlines. A bride's virginity guaranteed that any children born afterward belonged to her husband, and by extension, his property and inheritance. A non-virgin bride, that was a legal and social nightmare. If doubts surfaced after the wedding, her husband could annul the marriage, throw her out, or worse. Her family could lose their dowry, their status, their carefully arranged alliance. So yeah, stakes were high. You'd think, with all this pressure, that there would be a reliable way to check. You'd be wrong. The medieval understanding of female anatomy was, let's call it creative. Many believed in the existence of a virginal seal that would break and bleed during first intercourse. No bleeding, no virgin, except we now know that's not how bodies work. And surprise, plenty of women in the Middle Ages knew it too. So they got clever. Enter the art of faking it. Some girls were coached by their midwives or friends on how to stage their wedding night. The methods range from sneaky to theatrical, pricking a finger to smear blood on the sheets, hiding a small bladder of animal blood under the mattress, even using red wine or beet juice. It was all about the aftermath, the stained linen that would be triumphantly displayed to waiting relatives as proof of purity and honour, a medieval version of a 5-star Yelp review. But not all attempts were successful. There are court records of newlyweds being called in because no blood was found. Sometimes the husband demanded annulment, sometimes the woman was publicly shamed, sometimes she simply disappeared, and sometimes, hilariously, the husband was too timid or drunk to consummate the marriage, blamed the bride, and still demanded a refund. The church often sided with the man, because of course they did. And then there's the deeply uncomfortable ritual of virginity tests. In some regions, especially among the nobility, suspicious families or betrothed husbands would hire a midwife to physically inspect the bride before marriage. Yes, that means what you think it means. It was invasive, humiliating, medically meaningless, and treated with deadly seriousness. A failed test could derail the entire wedding. A past one, however suspect, could calm a nervous suitor. And who decided the outcome? The midwife. Sometimes she told the truth. Sometimes she said what she knew the family wanted to hear. Ironically, the church itself had a love-hate relationship with virginity. On the one hand, virginity was held up as the ideal state, pure, holy, close to God. Virgin martyrs were celebrated, venerated, and carved into every second stained glass window. On the other hand, virginity was also seen as a ticking time bomb of temptation. A young woman who hadn't had sex yet was considered spiritually dangerous. Her unspent desire could lead men astray, so she needed to be married off quickly or tucked into a convent, preferably before she realised what her body was capable of. That contradiction, purity as power, purity as peril, was everywhere. Virginity wasn't just about sex, it was about control. Control of female bodies, female choices, and female futures. A virgin daughter was an asset. A non-virgin one was a scandal. And the whole system depended on silence, on fear, on pretending that the impossible standard could be met. But not everyone played by the rules. In the streets and fields and corners of city taverns, women bent the system. Some had premarital sex and got away with it. Some found ways to restore their virginity with herbs and pressure point massages. Yes, seriously, there were instructions for this. Some seduced their way into better marriages. Others, more defiant, refused to marry at all. Take Marjorie, for example, a real woman from 15th century England who was married young, gave birth, then claimed a vision from God telling her to live in celibacy, while still legally married. Her husband agreed, and Marjorie went on a cross-country pilgrimage, speaking openly about sex, morality, and her decision to be a spiritual virgin. People found her annoying. Church officials threatened her. But she kept talking, loudly. Or consider the tales of noblewomen who were rumoured to have failed virginity tests, but still married into power because their families were too influential to be challenged. It was never just about purity. It was about who could afford to fake it, cover it up, or bulldoze the consequences. A quirky fact worth noting. There were some rare cases where men were expected to prove their virginity too, usually in religious contexts like monks preparing for ordination. But the standards were far looser, the inspections rarer, and the stakes laughably lower. It's almost like the system was built with a particular gender imbalance in mind. Almost. Scholars still debate how often women were actually tested, how widespread the blood-stained sheet tradition really was, and how much pressure was applied outside of the noble class. Some argue that the average peasant woman, with no land or dowry to bargain with, wasn't as scrutinised. Others say that virginity was so tightly woven into Christian moral teaching that even poor women felt the weight of it. The truth? Probably both. Back in the bedroom, the bride-to-be is pulling a white ribbon from a chest, one she's been told to tie around her thigh tonight, for luck, or purity, or some other symbol no one can fully explain. She sighs. You can't tell if she's nervous or resigned. Maybe both. Tomorrow she'll stand beside a man she barely knows. She'll nod when the priest asks if she's pure. She'll smile. And later, as the crowd waits in the next room, she'll hope the wine, the candlelight, and the carefully hidden packet of pig's blood will be enough to buy her a future. And if it's not, well, she has a friend whose cousin knows a midwife near the city gate, and that midwife never asks questions. You're crouched behind a crumbling wall in the outer courtyard of a monastery garden, watching two young men sneak glances at each other over the heads of their fellow scribes. Their fingers brush briefly while reaching for the same scroll, and they both recoil, not from each other, but from the risk. Because in the Middle Ages, same-sex love isn't just forbidden, it's dangerous, life-threatening, erased, and yet it keeps showing up in the margins, in letters, in whispered rumours, in moments like this one. Fleeting, electric, and too meaningful to be accidental. Tonight we step into the hidden, often erased world of LGBTQ+ lives in medieval Europe, specifically how people loved and desired each other when those feelings didn't fit the heterosexual mould the church insisted was natural and holy. Spoiler, it's complicated, it's heartbreaking, and sometimes surprisingly beautiful. First, let's talk about the rules. Medieval Europe, especially under the heavy hand of the Catholic Church, condemned same-sex activity as a mortal sin. Not just a bad idea. A go straight to hell, do not pass go level offence. It was lumped under the category of sodomy, a term so vague it could mean anything from consensual same-sex acts to bestiality, or even non-procreative heterosexual sex. Theologians couldn't agree on definitions, but they all agreed it was bad, really bad. And yet, people did it. People fell in love, formed secret partnerships, carved coded messages into tree bark and chapel benches. They existed in the quiet margins of society, always at risk, but always reaching for each other anyway. Some found fleeting safety in monastic life, where deep emotional bonds between men were normalized, even romanticized, under the label of spiritual brotherhood. These relationships sometimes crossed over into the physical. Church officials were aware. Monks were sometimes punished. But many of these bonds remained hidden, protected by silence and the absence of proof. One case from 14th century England tells of two nuns caught loving each other beyond what is natural. They were separated, their letters confiscated. The documents, full of longing and tenderness, were copied into church records, perhaps as a warning, perhaps out of curiosity. But they survived, and centuries later we can still read their words. They speak of touch, of yearning, of shared dreams that had no place in the world around them. Now here's a twist. Medieval people didn't have the same concepts of sexual orientation that we use today. The idea of being gay or straight as an identity simply didn't exist. Desire was seen more as an action than a state of being. You weren't labelled by your preference. You were judged by your behaviour. That made room for all sorts of fluidity. It also made things terrifyingly arbitrary. A person could go their whole life hiding or rationalising their feelings until one mistake or one enemy ruined them. Take the poet Richard de Fournival. He wrote passionate verses about male beauty that scholars still puzzle over today. Was he writing in a classical style, copying Greek aesthetics, or was he expressing something personal, masked in academic language? The line between admiration and desire was blurred, often deliberately, and it gave people just enough space to hint without declaring. For women, things were murkier. Female friendships were expected to be close, even physically affectionate. Two women living together might raise eyebrows, but not always alarms, unless they were caught. And even then, the church often struggled to articulate exactly what the sin was. One 15th century German case describes a woman being tried for taking the role of a man in bed. What did that mean? Strap-on? Finger play? The records don't say, but the ambiguity didn't stop her from being punished. The accusation alone was enough. Still, lesbian relationships, though less documented, weren't invisible. The term trebades appears in several texts, often in the same breath as witchcraft and heresy. They were feared, yes, but also eroticized, especially by male writers who turned female intimacy into scandalous fantasy for elite consumption. Some manuscript illuminations even feature what scholars believe are coded depictions of female couples, often nestled among animals and mythic beasts, hidden in the manuscript margins like visual gossip. That's where much of LGBTQ+ medieval history lives, in the margins, literally. Take the marginalia in certain medieval prayer books, where monks doodled rabbits in compromising positions or monks embracing behind walls. Some are clearly jokes, others, you get the sense they were cathartic, confessions disguised as humour, longing scratched onto parchment when no one was watching. Here's a quirky historical footnote. There are surviving love poems written from one man to another in Old Occitan, the language of the troubadours. These weren't bawdy or comedic. They were courtly, romantic, full of metaphors about the moon and longing glances and sleepless nights. Some scholars argue they were just poetic exercises. Others say they were sincere, but regardless of intent, they reveal a cultural space, however narrow, where same-sex desire could be voiced, even if it had to wear a mask. Scholars continue to argue over how to interpret these texts. Some claim we're projecting modern ideas onto a world that didn't frame sexuality the way we do. Others insist that erasing queer desire from history just because it wasn't labelled is, itself, a form of modern bias. The truth probably lies somewhere in the middle. Medieval people didn't use our words, but they still felt our feelings. And for those who acted on those feelings, the risks were enormous. Inquisition records show that men accused of sodomy could be tortured, imprisoned, even executed. In Florence during the 15th century, an entire Office of the Night was created to investigate male homosexual activity. Hundreds of men were prosecuted. Most were fined, a few were burned. All lived in fear. Even the suspicion could destroy a life. And yet, desire persisted. Because it always does. You step away from the garden wall and leave the two scribes to their moment. Maybe they'll do nothing more than steal glances for years. Maybe they'll write each other cautious letters. Maybe, in some tiny sliver of luck, they'll find a corner of the world that lets them be together in peace. It's not common, it's not safe, but it happens, and it always has. The bells toll again, echoing through the stone halls. Somewhere a monk chants a prayer, somewhere else a woman fingers a ribbon from her companion and smiles, thinking of a kiss that no one saw. And you? You carry their stories forward, pulled from the margins and into the light. You're sitting uncomfortably on a stone bench in a sun-drenched courtyard, watching a nobleman read aloud to a lady from a small gilt-edged book, while trying very hard to look like he's not reading from memory. The lady is pretending to listen, fanning herself lazily with a piece of lace. He quotes poetry about her eyes. She replies with a clever line about falcons and loyalty. No one touches. No one says what they really want. This, dear traveller, is courtly love, a painfully repressed, overly poetic and often entirely sexless medieval invention that somehow convinced generations of nobles that longing was better than having. At first glance, courtly love looks romantic. A chivalrous knight falls head over heels for a beautiful lady, usually married, and dedicates his sword, his songs, and sometimes his entire life to her. He writes poems, composes songs, and maybe even duels in her honour. She, in turn, might drop him a glove or allow him the exquisite agony of dancing 3 feet from her at a feast. Actual sex? Absolutely not. That would ruin the whole thing. The passion lies in the not touching, the tragedy, the chase. You'd think this system was created by a woman trying to keep her suitors at arm's length, but no, it was mostly invented by men. Specifically, bored, bookish, aristocratic men with too much time, too many hormones, and way too many feelings. The entire genre of courtly love flourished in 12th century southern France, at the courts of noble women like Eleanor of Aquitaine and her daughter Marie of Champagne, who patronised poets known as troubadours. These weren't barroom bards. They were educated, lyrical, dramatic, and honestly a little bit emo. Troubadours wrote of unconsummated desire, of ladies too noble to be touched, of knights willing to die for a single look. There were rules, yes, actual rules, of courtly love. A whole code of conduct was laid out in treatises like Andreas Capellanus's The Art of Courtly Love, which basically said things like, True love cannot exist within marriage. Love must always be secret, and it's better to suffer in love than to ever be satisfied. So if you've ever felt friend-zoned by a Renaissance fair reenactor, now you know why. It's worth noting how different this is from the church's idea of love. The church was deeply uncomfortable with passion, especially when it didn't result in children and wasn't within a marital framework. Courtly love, ironically, shared that unease with actual sex, but not because it was sinful, because it was mundane. Once lovers actually got together, the magic was over. The poem ended. The longing dried up. So courtly, love elevated desire into a kind of holy suffering. The more you hurt, the more noble your feelings were. But of course, this was a game, and like all games, not everyone followed the rules. Behind the poetry and platonic agony, real affairs happened. Not everyone was satisfied with gazing from a balcony. Knights and ladies found ways to slip behind curtains or wander too far from the hunting party. Some affairs were passionate, some were calculated, some resulted in scandal or exile or worse. One juicy example, Lancelot and Guinevere. Yep, the famous Arthurian lovers weren't just fictional drama magnets. They were modelled on the ideals of courtly love, with all its tortured devotion and forbidden longing. Lancelot fights for her, bleeds for her, rides through impossible danger just to glimpse her face. And when they finally sleep together, it basically ends Camelot. Love destroys order. Sex ruins purity. A very medieval moral, if there ever was one. But not all these stories were tragedies. Some noble couples carried on long-term affairs in the courtly style, balancing real affection with public restraint. Letters survive from 14th century noble lovers who signed off with tearful goodbyes, elaborate metaphors, and subtle references to actual liaisons. In one letter, a countess compares her lover's voice to the bells of a chapel and laments that she can only worship at his altar in dreams. That's either painfully poetic or a very clumsy euphemism. Interestingly, courtly love also gave women, especially noble women, an unusual kind of power. Since the whole system revolved around the lady being distant, unattainable and superior, it gave her control over the narrative. She could encourage, delay, or reject the knight's advances at her whim. In real life, of course, things weren't so simple. A lady who rejected a powerful man's affection might still be punished, but within this poetic game she ruled. Scholars still debate how real courtly love was. Was it just a literary device? A poetic fantasy indulged by a small elite? Or did it shape actual relationships? Some argue it was escapism, a way for people stuck in arranged marriages to imagine a more thrilling emotional life. Others say it served to reinforce social hierarchies. You can admire the lady, but you can't touch her. Know your place. And here's a weird fringe fact. Some courtly love manuals advised young men to start by seducing lower-class women, because they were seen as practice for the real love of a noblewoman. That's right. Peasant girls were treated like training wheels, casual misogyny with a lute accompaniment. The church, predictably, had mixed feelings. On one hand, courtly love encouraged chastity and delayed gratification. On the other, it made lust seem noble. Worse, it implied that marriage was a dull obligation while real love, the poetic, burning, unconsummated kind, was something to seek outside of it. That was dangerous. So priests condemned courtly love in sermons, while secretly copying down the poems to read later. You're still sitting in that courtyard, watching the nobleman grow increasingly red-faced as he recites a particularly florid stanza involving roses, longing, and spiritual agony. The lady yawns, nods, and hands him a handkerchief, a clear signal that he's won a favour. He beams like he's just conquered a kingdom. You'd think she offered him her soul, but really she just didn't tell him to go away. And maybe, for him, that's enough. Because in the world of courtly love, the ache is the point. The suffering is the story. Sex is either never achieved or never satisfying. The whole structure is built on a pedestal so tall, no one actually wants to climb it. Just stare at it, write a sonnet, and sigh into the wind. The lantern outside the door swings lazily in the evening breeze, casting a soft glow over a wooden placard shaped like a heart, though a slightly lopsided one. You step through the low archway and into a room that smells of lavender, warm bread, and something just slightly smoky, like a candle that's burned too long. A woman in a crimson gown leans on the bar, chatting with a man who definitely didn't come here to rent a room for the night. This isn't an inn, it's a brothel, and if you think that means sleaze, shame, or shady dealings in dark alleys, surprise. In much of medieval Europe, prostitution was legal, regulated, and sometimes even weirdly, respected. Not universally, of course. In rural villages, sex work was rare and usually hidden, and in hyper-religious communities it could lead to scorn or even punishment. But in cities, especially thriving trade centres like Paris, London or Lübeck, prostitution was so common that trying to ban it was like trying to stop people from breathing. So instead of fighting it, many cities chose to manage it. By the 13th century, brothels in some areas were official institutions, often run by municipalities, taxed by local governments, and guarded by laws to protect both clients and workers. Yes, really. The local bishop might still thunder about sin and damnation, but the mayor was more interested in whether you'd paid your licensing fee. One of the most famous examples comes from the south of France, where city brothels were inspected regularly to make sure the rooms were clean-ish, the sheets were aired, sometimes, and the women were healthy, debatable. In some towns, sex workers had to wear specific clothing, yellow veils in some places, striped hoods in others, to distinguish them from respectable women. This wasn't just for moral policing, it was branding, a signal, an advertisement. Step inside one of these brothels and you might be surprised by what you find. It's not all grunting and gloom. There are candles, soft music, perhaps even a lute player if you've wandered into a higher-end establishment. The women here know how to flirt, soothe egos and pour wine without spilling. Many are skilled in conversation, basic medicine, even song. They're not just selling sex, they're selling attention, escape, and for a brief moment, the illusion that someone actually wants to listen to your complaints about your mother-in-law. And make no mistake, this was work, hard work. Women entered prostitution for all kinds of reasons. Poverty, widowhood, abandonment, lack of dowry, or sheer survival. For some, it was the only path available that offered food, a roof, and some degree of control. A few even earned enough to retire, marry or buy property, though this was the exception, not the rule. Most lived on the edge, balancing danger, exhaustion, and constant scrutiny. Here's a quirky detail. In 15th century Nuremberg, Germany, brothels were so organised that sex workers had designated days off and access to physicians. The city even paid for repairs to the buildings. That's right, public funds for brothel maintenance. Try getting that passed in modern city council. Of course, none of this erased the stigma. Even in cities where brothels were tolerated, sex workers lived in a liminal space. Not criminals, but not citizens either. They couldn't testify in court. They couldn't inherit. They could be punished for theft or insult, but not defend themselves against abuse. And if they left the profession, rejoining decent society was nearly impossible. Still, brothels weren't always shameful places. In some neighbourhoods they were lively social hubs. Men gathered not just for sex, but for gossip, games, drinking and music. Women working there formed tight-knit communities, looking out for each other in a world that offered little safety. They shared tips, clients, cures and heartbreaks. Some brothels had house rules. No violence, no underage clients, no haggle once the price was set. Break the rules? You were out. Or, worse, on latrine cleaning duty for a week. Scholars continue to debate whether this system was empowering or exploitative. The answer, predictably, is both. Legal regulation gave some women a measure of protection, but it also institutionalised their marginalisation. They were needed, but never honoured. Visible, but never welcomed. And their bodies were commodities the moment they crossed the threshold. And it wasn't just cisgender women. There's limited but tantalising evidence that male and even transgender sex workers existed in some cities. They faced even greater risk, but occasionally found niche clientele among wealthy or high-ranking men. Some documents from Florence and Venice hint at male brothels catering specifically to clergy and nobility, though naturally these were denied by everyone involved the moment things got awkward, which they always did. Inside the brothel, a woman named Beatrice leans over the table, cracking a joke that makes her client laugh so hard he nearly spills his drink. She's good at this. She knows how to gauge a man's mood before he says a word, knows how to guide the evening with practiced ease. She also knows how to spot lice, how to detect a syphilitic rash before it spreads, and how to brew a tea that keeps most pregnancies at bay. You watch as she stands, takes her customer by the hand, and leads him gently to one of the curtained rooms. The lute player strums a slow melody. Outside, a watchman passes by, glances at the red heart over the door, and keeps walking. He knows better than to interfere, because as much as the city claims to condemn sin, it still taxes the pleasure. As much as the priests warn against temptation, their confessions tell a different story. And as much as medieval society shames these women, it relies on them, quietly, consistently, hypocritically. Later, Beatrice will sit by the hearth, counting coins, rubbing her feet, and sharing stories with the other women. Maybe they'll talk about the wealthy man who came back 3 nights in a row. Maybe they'll whisper about the girl who ran off with a baker. Maybe they'll simply fall asleep, grateful to have made it through another night. And you? You slip out quietly, heart heavy with contradictions. This wasn't a scandal. It was survival. It still is. You're staring at what looks like a medieval chastity belt in a glass display case. It's cold, it's metal, it's got hinges where hinges shouldn't be, and it's covered in terrifying little spikes that scream "stay out," with all the subtlety of a cathedral bell. But here's the thing. Take a step closer, and you might start to notice something odd. The rivets are too modern. The design's a little too theatrical, and the placard beneath it doesn't mention anything about the belt being authentic, because, plot twist, chastity belts, at least the way we imagine them, are probably a myth. Let's break it down. You've heard the story. A nobleman goes off to war, probably a crusade, and before leaving he locks a heavy metal belt onto his wife or daughter to ensure she stays pure. He takes the key, maybe gives a spare to his priest. She spends the next 6 years using a chamber pot through a hole in the thing, hoping she doesn't get tetanus. Sound familiar? It should. That's been the popular image of chastity belts for centuries. It's also very likely nonsense. Historically, there's virtually no concrete evidence that chastity belts were used during the Middle Ages in the way Victorian minds and modern movies like to imagine. There are no confirmed surviving examples from the 12th or 13th centuries. Most of the belts you see in museums. They're either Renaissance-era novelties, outright 19th century fakes, or straight-up joke pieces meant to mock prudishness. So where did the idea even come from? The first textual mentions of something resembling a chastity belt appear in 15th century satirical literature. Italian poets and French authors started referencing these belts in jokes and allegories, usually to poke fun at jealous husbands, or to illustrate how absurd it would be to try to control a woman's desire with hardware. And yet somehow, satire turned into rumour turned into historical fact, and soon everyone believed that medieval Europe was full of iron-clad virgins jingling as they walked. By the 19th century, with its wild mix of moral panic, Victorian modesty, and a fascination with medieval kitsch, chastity belts had become a creepy symbol of feminine virtue. Museums began collecting them, real or not, and the myth solidified. And let's be honest, people kind of wanted it to be true. It's lurid, it's dramatic, it fits our modern image of the Middle Ages as a time of total repression and absurd control. But historical reality, always more complicated. There were ways people tried to control female sexuality in the Middle Ages, just not necessarily with locks and keys. For noblewomen, surveillance was constant. They were surrounded by maids, chaperones, and sometimes literally locked into towers or cloisters. Rules about where they could go, who they could see, and what they could wear were rigid, and the psychological chastity belt, constant pressure, public shame and threats of ruin, was arguably more effective than a piece of iron ever could be. There are also records of symbolic belts, embroidered sashes or woven cords that women wore as tokens of chastity. These weren't intended to be physical barriers but moral reminders, often given by parents or betrothed men. The girdle of chastity might have been more of a poetic metaphor than a plumbing nightmare. Still, not everyone agrees. Some scholars argue that there might have been real chastity belts used in isolated cases, not as a daily garment, but maybe as a kind of symbolic punishment or tool of short-term control. A bishop punishing a nun, a jealous husband using fear more than function. But these cases are hypothetical, based more on inference than hard evidence. No woman left behind a diary saying, "Dear God, please let him lose the key this time." And even if a belt had existed, you have to ask the practical questions like hygiene, rust, chafing. Do you have any idea what wearing a tight-fitting metal contraption for weeks, or even hours, would do to your skin, or your bladder, or your soul? It would be a disaster. So unless the goal was actually torture, and to be fair, sometimes it was, wearing one long-term simply wouldn't work. That brings us to the more sinister use of the chastity belt myth, the way it was weaponized. In later centuries, particularly during the Victorian era, these belts were sometimes presented as necessary. Girls were protected from masturbation, from temptation, from imagined dangers that mostly lived in their parents' heads. Doctors even recommended similar devices to prevent hysteria and impure urges. Yes, that actually happened. And it says more about 19th century fear of sexuality than it does about medieval life. A fringe fact you might not expect. Some supposed medieval chastity belts are now believed to have been anti-rape devices designed for travellers, women going long distances without protection. Think of them as the most horrifying version of a bicycle lock you can imagine. Again, no solid proof these were ever used, but the idea resurfaced during war periods in the early 20th century, when fear, propaganda and misogyny collided in a very uncomfortable way. Back in your museum, a group of tourists wanders by. Someone laughs, someone else shudders. The docent gives a rehearsed explanation, vague enough to avoid a definitive claim. You look back at the belt. It's rusty, it's dramatic, it's probably a lie. But like many things in medieval history, the chastity belt has more symbolic power than literal truth. It's a fantasy, one built on anxiety, control and misunderstanding. It tells us more about how later societies imagined the Middle Ages than about how people actually lived. Because the real tools of control weren't locked between a woman's legs. They were whispered in her ear, carved into law, etched into sermons. You leave the exhibit with a half smile, half grimace. The belt may be fake, but the obsession it represents? That's very, very real. You're standing in the middle of a crowded village square, and you're not alone. All eyes are fixed on the wooden platform in front of the church steps. On it, a man stands with a look of resigned shame, his hands locked through the holes of a wooden pillory. His tunic is dusted with flour, his face red. Not from rage, but from the bucket of fish guts someone just chucked at his head. He's not a thief or a heretic. He's here because he had sex with the miller's wife. And in this village, that's not just gossip. It's a crime. Welcome to the medieval hall of shame, where sex wasn't just a personal matter, but a public spectacle. Punishment for sexual misbehaviour wasn't hidden behind closed doors. It was hauled out into the daylight, often quite literally. Stocks, fines, confessions and humiliations weren't just methods of correction. They were part of a moral performance, one designed to reinforce the social order by making examples of the lustful, the disobedient and the unlucky. Let's be clear, the church was not messing around. From bishops to parish priests, the clergy wielded enormous power in deciding who was out of line and what penance they owed. Confession was supposed to be private, sure, but the punishment, that was everyone's business. Committed adultery? You might be marched barefoot through the streets, slept with someone before marriage, prepare to kneel in the front of the church in your underclothes while everyone else chants psalms pointedly in your direction. And it wasn't just the church handing out punishments. Secular courts often dealt with sex-related offences too. Local lords, town councils, and even guilds had their own rules about who could sleep with whom and when. Break those rules? You'd pay. Literally. Fines were the go-to punishment, especially for the upper class. You might get off easy if you had the coin. But if you were poor, you got the stocks. Or worse. Take the case of Agnes, a servant girl from 14th century England. She was caught with her master's son, behind the stable, in the middle of the day. The court fined the boy's family and forced Agnes to wear a white smock and processed through the village holding a sign that read, "Wanton and disobedient." Did the boy get punished too? Technically, he had to make a small donation to the local monastery. You can imagine how deeply that changed him. Double standards were everywhere. Men, especially noblemen, could often wriggle out of trouble with money or connections. Women bore the brunt of social consequences. A man's adultery was seen as an unfortunate indulgence. A woman's, a scandal, a threat to inheritance, honour and the entire moral order. There are records of women being shaved, bald, whipped, or permanently expelled from towns for fornication. Meanwhile, their partners in crime went home to dinner. One particularly grim form of punishment involved enforced marriage. If a couple was caught having sex and the woman became pregnant, they might be forced to marry, immediately, publicly, and with zero say in the matter. A marriage built on shame and coercion, sponsored by the local priest. Very romantic. But even outside of formal punishment, shame was weaponized in everyday life. Gossip was practically a public utility. If someone thought you were loose, you could find yourself the subject of street songs, painted insults on your door, or symbolic garbage dumped in your yard. One 15th century record from Flanders describes a woman who was paraded through town, with a fish tied to her belt, a crude symbol of female genitalia, after being accused of excessive lust. The man involved, not even mentioned, and let's not forget the weird punishments. In parts of rural France, a man caught committing adultery might be forced to run naked through the village while clanging a bell. In the Low Countries, some offenders were ordered to sit backward on a donkey, while townspeople threw old vegetables. In some German cities, couples caught in premarital sex had to wear matching signs reading "We couldn't wait" during Sunday Mass. Honestly, the creativity was impressive, also petty. Now here's where things get academically juicy. Scholars still debate how often these punishments were actually enforced. Were public shaming rituals common, or were they exaggerated in records and sermons to scare people straight? Some argue that most infractions were handled quietly. Confession, penance, move on. Others point to municipal records overflowing with sex-related fines, suggesting that these punishments were very real, very public, and very effective. What seems clear is this: the fear of being seen was more powerful than the fear of hell. People could handle divine punishment. They'd fast, say prayers, maybe donate a goat. But being mocked by your neighbours, that stuck. That followed you to the market, to the church, to every social interaction. It was a kind of slow exile, carried out through laughter and side eyes. That's why people went to such elaborate lengths to hide their liaisons. Cloaks and nighttime walks, bribes and false names, couriers with fake letters, locks, lookouts, secret tunnels, and if all else failed, a good midwife who could lie under oath. Because once the shame machine started, it was almost impossible to stop. And yet, despite all this, despite the risks, the punishment, the humiliation, people still did it. Over and over, they fell in love, gave in to lust, lied, snuck out, got caught. You can't build a perfect wall around human desire, no matter how many priests you station on the battlements. Back in the square, the pilloried man sneezes as a turnip hits him square in the nose. Somewhere in the crowd, someone starts singing a bawdy verse with suspiciously specific details. People laugh. A priest frowns. The man stares at the ground. He'll be released at sunset, his fine paid, his shame complete. Tomorrow, someone else will take his place. Maybe a girl caught kissing her betrothed too soon. Maybe a widow with too many male visitors. Maybe someone entirely innocent caught in the wrong story. And the town will gather again, not for justice, not even for God, but for the performance. Because in the medieval world, sex wasn't just private sin, it was public theatre, and everyone wanted a front row seat. You're seated on a rough wooden stool in a cramped apothecary kitchen that smells like rosemary, dried sweat, and something vaguely rotten. Across from you, an elderly woman is crushing something into a fine paste using a mortar and pestle that's seen more use than the village altar. Her hands move with practiced rhythm, and she doesn't flinch when a small spark leaps from the fireplace behind her. For love, she says, nodding at the paste. Or for lust, depending on how much you add. You raise your eyebrows. She smiles a toothless grin. Everything's about dosage. Welcome to the slippery world of medieval love magic, where potions, charms, and magical rites were used not just to find love, but to manipulate it. If you've ever thought modern dating apps were shady, let's just say they've got nothing on a good old-fashioned beaver testicle tonic. Love spells and aphrodisiacs were a strange tangled intersection of herbal medicine, folk tradition, and superstition. They weren't taught in universities or sanctioned by the church, obviously, but they flourished in whispers and dark corners, passed from midwives to apprentices, from lonely shepherd boys to desperate merchant wives, and for many people, these rituals were taken as seriously as prayer, sometimes more. Want someone to fall in love with you? Easy. Grind some dried rose petals with powdered cinnamon, steep them in wine, and whisper their name over it 3 times while circling a candle flame. Want to stir up passion in a cold marriage? Mix honey, mint, and a bit of bull's blood. Don't have bull's blood. Pig urine was sometimes used in a pinch. Was it fragrant? Number, was it effective? Debatable. But belief, as always, did a lot of the heavy lifting. And then there were the real aphrodisiacs, the heavy hitters. Certain foods and herbs were believed to stir up the humours, those mysterious bodily fluids that medieval medicine insisted controlled everything from digestion to desire. Ginger and mustard were said to heat the blood. Garlic, interestingly, was considered too passionate for monks. Fennel, saffron, basil, all rumoured to increase lust. Want to go full throttle? Try dried wolf penis, powdered sparrow brain, or a beaver's scent gland called castoreum. Fun fact, that last one was used for centuries, often in perfume, and yes, sometimes ingested. Let's all take a moment to be grateful for modern chemistry. If you were really committed, you could go the charm route. Medieval charm spells often involved tying knots in strings while reciting love prayers, drawing symbols under bedsheets, or burying tokens near a lover's doorway. Some charms got creepier, like baking a small piece of your fingernail into bread and feeding it to your crush. Nothing says forever yours like surprise body parts in your pastry. What about when the passion cooled? When your husband grew distant or your wife stopped noticing you? Time to up the magical ante. There were powders designed to be slipped into ale, charms meant to reawaken desire, and in rare cases, much darker recipes involving graveyard dirt or menstrual blood. One Italian grimoire from the 15th century suggests rubbing a paste made from bat heart and mare's milk onto your chest before bed to make someone dream of you. How did they come up with this? Trial and error? Divine inspiration? Sheer boredom? We may never know. Of course, this kind of magic walked a very thin line. A lonely villager trying to charm a crush might be shrugged off. A servant girl caught boiling a love potion in her employer's kitchen? That was grounds for punishment, sometimes severe. The church drew little distinction between folk magic and outright heresy. Any attempt to manipulate love or lust through unnatural means was viewed as aligning with the devil. It didn't help that many love spells borrowed language from old pagan rituals, or that some spells worked in reverse, used not to attract, but to curse desire. That's right. There were also medieval anti-lust spells, designed to cool passion, render rivals impotent or break up couples. Petty, powerful, and deeply unsettling. One famous trial from the 14th century records a woman accused of using love magic to seduce a married nobleman. Her crimes included brewing potions, owning books of forbidden Latin, and keeping a locked box of hair trimmings and fingernails, allegedly from her victim. She denied everything, claimed she was simply a healer. The court didn't buy it. She was fined, whipped, and banned from the town. What happened to the nobleman? Nothing. He wasn't even asked to testify. Of course. It's easy to mock these rituals now, beaver testicles and all, but it's important to remember what they represented. In a world with limited agency, especially for women and the poor, love magic was a way to take control, to push back against fate, biology, and social boundaries. If you couldn't legally choose your partner, maybe you could magically influence him. If your body was owned by your husband, maybe you could use herbs to keep your passion elsewhere. It was resistance, not always healthy, not always fair, but very, very human. And here's the open question scholars still debate. How much of this was metaphor? Were these recipes really used, or were they symbolic? Was bat heart shorthand for emotional pain? Was not magic just a way of describing emotional entanglement? Maybe. But there's enough material, enough court records, personal letters, scribbled marginalia, to suggest that people really tried this stuff, and sometimes they swore it worked. You watch as the elderly apothecary pours the now finished mixture into a small jar, seals it with wax and ties it with twine. "Tell her to drink it warm," she says, handing it to a young man who blushes scarlet and stammers a thank you. She watches him go with a faint, knowing smile. She's done this before. She'll do it again tomorrow. The fire cracks. The room smells of time and secrets. Outside, the wind stirs the trees, and somewhere, a heart beats a little faster. Not from magic, maybe, but from hope. You're standing at the foot of a straw-filled bed, awkwardly holding a wooden bowl of broth that no one asked you to bring. The woman lying in the bed looks exhausted, sweaty, pale, and very much not in the mood for visitors. Her husband hovers nearby, wringing his hands like he's about to ask for permission to enter a room that technically already belongs to both of them. This isn't just a postnatal moment, this is a waiting game. Because for the next several weeks, maybe even months, this couple won't be touching each other. Not because they're tired, though they are, and not because of a screaming newborn, though there is one, but because the church says they can't. Welcome to medieval postpartum sex rules. You thought childbirth was the end of the ordeal? Huh, it's just the intermission. Let's start with the basics. In medieval Christian Europe, sex after childbirth wasn't just discouraged, it was outright forbidden for a specific period of time. According to both church doctrine and long-standing folk belief, a woman was considered unclean after giving birth, spiritually, physically, even socially. She was temporarily excluded from many aspects of religious and communal life, including, yes, her own marriage bed. This wasn't just about blood or medical recovery, it was theological. The idea came in part from the Old Testament, specifically the book of Leviticus, which outlined purity laws involving bodily fluids, childbirth, and uncleanness. The church carried over some of that framework, blending it with medieval interpretations of original sin, female impurity, and the belief that childbirth left a woman in a spiritually liminal state, a sort of purgatory, but for your uterus. The result? A ritual called churching. It wasn't a baptism for the baby, but a kind of symbolic re-entry for the mother. After a set number of days, typically 40 for a boy, 80 for a girl because of course, she would attend a short ceremony in the church where a priest blessed her, prayed over her, and officially welcomed her back into the Christian fold. Only then could she fully resume her role in society. Only then could she have sex again. Maybe. So what did that mean practically? It meant that new parents, still reeling from birth, hunger and sleep deprivation, were expected to keep their hands to themselves for over a month, sometimes much longer. Husbands were warned not to defile their wives before churching. Women were told their bodies were dangerous, that sex during this time could sicken a man, curse a child, or invite demons. Not metaphorical ones, actual demons. The kind that hung out in corners and whispered lustful thoughts into people's ears. And if the woman died before being churched, that was a big deal. Her body might not be allowed to rest in consecrated ground. Her death could be seen as a kind of divine judgment. Superstition swirled around these ideas, turning postpartum recovery into a complex spiritual balancing act. The pressure wasn't just on the body, it was on the soul. But of course, just because the rules existed didn't mean everyone followed them. Some couples waited, others didn't. Records of penance for relations before churching pop up now and then in court documents and confessions. The punishments weren't always severe, sometimes just a few days of fasting or a symbolic fine, but the shame, that lingered, especially for the woman. Still, there's a surprising undercurrent of empathy in some of these customs. For all its judgmental theology, the church also offered postpartum women something they didn't often get: rest. The idea that a woman needed 40 days of recovery before returning to labour, sex, or even public life created a kind of protective pause. She wasn't expected to clean, sew, or churn butter immediately. Her friends and neighbours, other women mostly, formed a lying-in circle, bringing food, care, and gossip. It was a sacred pause in a world that rarely offered breathers. Midwives played a huge role here, not just in delivery, but in protecting the mother's recovery. They monitored bleeding, checked stitches if any were made, and enforced rest when husbands got impatient. One 14th century English midwife is recorded as telling a particularly pushy husband that the Holy Mother herself would slap him from heaven if he touched his wife too soon. You get the sense she may have said that more than once. There's also a huge scholarly debate over whether the postpartum taboo was rooted more in misogyny or medicine. Was it about spiritual cleanliness? Or was it an early, if awkward, recognition that the body needed time to heal? Some argue that this taboo reflects a surprisingly advanced understanding of the dangers of infection, hemorrhage, and physical trauma. Others say that's giving medieval society too much credit, that the rules were more about control than compassion. Maybe both are true. What we do know is that the pressure to purify the woman before returning her to her husband says a lot about the way sex and female bodies were viewed. The woman wasn't just recovering, she was being repaired, cleansed, reset. as if her very participation in childbirth had broken something sacred. It wasn't just about her either. The man's desire was also under scrutiny. To want your wife too soon was considered animalistic, selfish, and spiritually dangerous. Some priests preached that any man who lay with his wife before her churching risked losing his potency, or his soul. Talk about a mood killer, and yet people still made jokes about it. A few surviving folktales feature clever wives who trick their husbands into waiting. One spins a tale of a woman who sets fire to her own bed every night to discourage advances. Another hides a small crucifix in the sheets and claims she's been cursed to turn to stone if touched. Humour, even in hardship. It's the medieval way. Eventually the churching ritual faded from strict religious practice, lingering more as a cultural tradition. But echoes of it remained for centuries. Even today, some rural communities maintain postpartum customs that trace their roots back to this medieval pause, though thankfully without the demon warnings or public shaming. Back at the bedside, the woman dozes off at last, the newborn finally quiet in a wicker cradle nearby. Her husband sits at the edge of the bed, still wringing his hands, still unsure of his place. The rules have told him to wait, to be patient, to honour the sacred distance of recovery. For once he listens. Outside, the sun dips below the chapel roof. A bell tolls. The world keeps turning, slowly and painfully and full of awkward desire. But inside this room, there's a kind of peace. For now, you smell the plague before you see it. The sharp, sickly sweet odour of decay clings to everything. The wooden beams, the straw in the streets, even the wind. You pull your cloak tighter, though it won't help. There's no escaping the air, and no mistaking the silence. The laughter from the taverns has gone quiet. The brothel windows are shuttered. Even the church bells ring more like a warning than a welcome. You've arrived in the year of horror, somewhere around 1348, and everything, including sex, has changed. Because when death rides through the streets in black robes and boils, the last thing anyone's feeling is frisky. The Black Death didn't just devastate bodies, it ripped apart entire systems of living, including the messy, complicated, mostly unspoken rules around sex. When you're surrounded by mass graves, priests who've fled their parishes, and an entire city that smells like fever and despair, desire shifts into something more raw, more reckless, or in some cases it disappears completely. At first, people tried to carry on, business as usual. But as the bodies piled up and no one seemed to understand how the disease spread, panic set in. Fear seeped into every interaction. Touch became terrifying. Kissing a loved one could be lethal. Sharing a bed was no longer intimate, it was a gamble. And so, for many, sex became a casualty of the plague. Not banned, just quietly abandoned. That's not to say everyone abstained, quite the opposite. In some places, the plague triggered a kind of hedonistic explosion. Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die wasn't just a catchy proverb, it became survival logic. If death was coming anyway, why not indulge every craving? There are accounts of people drinking until they collapsed, dancing in the streets, sleeping with anyone who would say yes, or at least wouldn't say no. Monks broke vows, nobles slummed it with tavern girls, and all of it, of course, was followed by guilt. Then more indulgence, then more guilt. A fringe case comes from Siena, where a notary wrote that during the worst months of the plague, young people gathered in pleasure houses and pursued delights with neither shame nor caution. He was scandalised, obviously. But underneath the horror, there's something human about it. In the face of something so uncontrollable, pleasure becomes defiance. A middle finger to the reaper, a last spark